The first snow came down the same afternoon. Cordelia Hadley was told she no longer belonged in the house she had spent 11 years keeping warm. Not in spring. Not after the worst of winter had passed. Now. That very hour. While the light was still thin and gray over the Montana hills, and the cold was just beginning to settle its weight onto the valley like a hand pressing slowly down, she stood in the kitchen she had scrubbed 10,000 times. She knew every plank of that floor. She knew which board near the stove creaked under a heel and which one had warped the winter Silas first took ill. She knew the smell of the place better than she knew her own name. The smell of wood smoke and old iron and bread, and the faint sweetness of the dried apples hanging in the pantry. That kitchen had been hers in every way that mattered, even if it had never been hers on paper. And now a man half her age was standing across from her, telling her to leave it. Garrett Hadley would not look at her directly. That was the part she would remember longest. Not the words, the eyes, the way they slid sideways toward the window, toward the stove, toward the floor anywhere but her face. A man who could not meet your eyes while he ruined you was a man who already knew what he was doing was wrong. Cordelia had lived long enough to understand that much. 63 winters had taught her how to read a person by what they refused to look at. "You're capable enough to manage on your own," he said. "You always have been." It was meant to sound like a compliment. It landed like a sentence handed down by a judge. She did not answer him right away. She had learned over a long life that silence often said more than argument, and that a person in a hurry to do a cruel thing will fill that silence with the truth. If you let them wait long enough. Garrett shifted his weight. He pushed a small canvas sack across the table toward her. It slid over the worn wood and stopped near her hand. She looked down at it without touching it. A loaf of bread. 2 apples. A wool blanket folded so tightly it might have been made of stone. That was all. That was what 11 years was worth. She thought of everything those 11 years had held. She thought of the first morning she had come to this farm as Silas Hadley's new wife. No spring chicken even then, a widow herself who had buried one husband already and never expected to marry again. She remembered how the men in town had whispered that Silas was a fool to take a woman past 50, that she'd be no use to him, that she'd give him no sons, and no strength and no years. And she had outworked every one of those whispers. For 11 years she had risen before the sun. She had hauled water up from the creek with the ice cracking on the surface and her breath hanging white in the dark. She had cleaned the stalls in freezing rain with her fingers gone numb inside her gloves. She had mended fences after the spring storms tore them flat, driving the posts back into half-frozen ground with a maul that was nearly too heavy for her to lift. She had birthed calves in the dead of night and dragged firewood through snow up to her knees, and cooked meal after meal after meal in a kitchen that never seemed to grow cold so long as she was the one keeping it. And when Silas took sick, she had nursed him. 2 long winters she had nursed him. 2 winters of fever and coughing and the slow, terrible diminishment of a strong man into something frail and frightened. She had spooned broth between his lips when his own hands shook too badly to hold a cup. She had sat awake through the worst of the nights listening to him breathe, counting the gaps between each breath, terrified of the silence that would one day not end. She had washed him and turned him, and held his hand when the pain came. And she had never once complained, not to him, not to anyone, because that was what you did for the people you loved. You stayed. You stayed when staying cost you everything. And then, last autumn, Silas had died anyway. He died in the bed she had warmed for him every night. He died with his hand in hers and his eyes on her face. And the last thing he had said to her in a voice gone thin as paper was that she should not worry, that she would be looked after, that the family would see her right. The family. She looked across the table now at the family, At Garrett, his nephew, the only blood of Silas left in the valley. A young man with a strong back and a weak chin and an eagerness about him that Cordelia had mistaken for a little while after the funeral for grief. It had not been grief. "The nearest town is 15 miles, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. She would not let it shake. "You can find work there," Garrett said. "A woman who can do all you can do. Folks always need help." "In winter," she said. 15 miles in winter. And yeah, she watched the truth move across his face and saw him push it down. They both knew what the winter roads became once the snow set in. They both knew that the pass between this valley and that town closed entirely by the first hard storm, and that the first hard storm was already falling outside the window, even as he spoke. He was not telling her to leave and find a better life. He was telling her to walk out into a storm that would close behind her like a door. He was not asking her to go. He was asking her to disappear. The understanding settled into her slowly, the way the cold settles not all at once, but inch by inch until it has reached the center of you. She had been prepared for cruelty. She had not been prepared for this particular kind, the kind dressed up in kindness, the kind that hands you bread and a blanket, so that it can tell itself later that it gave you a chance. She might have argued. She had argued with men before, with bankers and ranch hands, and the doctor in town who had told her there was nothing more to be done for Silas. She knew how to argue. She knew her own worth, knew it down in her bones the way you know your own heartbeat, and she had the words to make a case for herself. But she looked at Garrett Hadley's face, at his sliding eyes, and she understood that there were no words. He had decided. The decision had been made long before this afternoon, long before the first snow. The snow had simply given him his excuse. So instead of arguing, she did something that surprised them both. She turned and she looked at the table behind him. It was Silas's old writing desk, dragged out into the main room since the funeral, and across its surface were spread a number of papers that Cordelia had not been meant to see. She had only a moment to look at them before Garrett moved to block her view. But a moment was enough. She had spent her whole life learning to take in a great deal in very little time, a skill earned by a life where you rarely got a second look at anything. She saw the maps first, long surveyor's drawings, the kind with neat straight lines ruled across them, marking out boundaries and elevations and the curve of the valley as seen from above. And printed across the top of one of them, in heavy black letters, were words she would not forget. Northern Continental Rail Survey. She saw the routes drawn in. She saw how they ran straight through the heart of the valley, through the very land she stood, on the very field she had worked for 11 years. She saw figures written in the margins, dollar figures larger than any sum of money she had ever seen written down in her life. And she saw at the bottom of one page, in a lawyer's careful hand, a list of names. The Hadley land, the deed, and beside it a note about heirs and claims and disputed title that she did not have time to read in full before Garrett stepped in front of the desk. But she had read enough. She had read enough to understand in one cold rush that she had been wrong about everything. Garrett Hadley was not casting her out because she was a burden. He was not doing it out of grief or carelessness or the simple selfishness of a young man who wanted a house to himself. He was doing it because of the railroad. Because the railroad was coming and the railroad would pay. And the only thing standing between Garrett Hadley and a fortune was a question of who held title to the Hadley land now that Silas was dead. And the answer to that question, the thing Garrett did not want anyone to look at too closely, was that Silas had married her. That made her something. A widow, a claimant, a name that a lawyer might write down beside the word heir. She was not being thrown out because she was worthless. She was being thrown out because she was worth too much. The realization should have frightened her more than it did. Perhaps it would later when there was room for fear. But standing there in that kitchen with the snow falling and the bread and the blanket waiting on the table, what she felt was not fear. What she felt was a strange, terrible clarity, because now she understood. And understanding was the one thing they could never take away from her, no matter how far they drove her into the snow. Garrett saw her face change. He did not know exactly what she had seen, but he saw that she had seen something, and his jaw tightened, and for the first time that afternoon, he looked at her straight on. "It's better this way," he said. "For everyone. For you," she said. It was the only thing she said. She let it sit there between them, simple and true. And she watched it land. He had no answer for it. There was no answer for it. He looked away again. Cordelia reached out and took the sack from the table. She did it slowly with dignity, the way she did everything. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her scramble. She picked up the bread and the apples and the folded blanket, and she held them against her chest, and she turned toward the row of pegs by the door where her coat hung. It was a good coat. She had made it herself years ago from heavy wool and lined it with an old quilt when the wool alone proved too thin for the mountain winters. It had kept her warm through 100 storms. She took it down now and put it on, working the buttons with hands that had grown stiff over the years, but had never grown weak. And then she did one more thing. On the shelf by the door sat a small wooden box. It had been Silas's. It held nothing of value, nothing Garrett would miss, only the small keepsakes of a quiet life, a pocket knife with a broken blade, a few coins, a lock of hair from a child who had died long before Cordelia ever knew him, and a letter. The letter was old, the paper soft with handling, the ink faded to brown. Silas had kept it for as long as she had known him, and he had read it sometimes on the quiet evenings, and once, when she had asked him about it, he had only smiled a sad smile and said it was from a man named August, a man who had lived up on the hill years ago. A man Silas had wronged somehow, or who had been wronged by the family. Cordelia had never been quite sure which. Silas had not liked to speak of it. The family did not speak of August Reed. She did not know in that moment why she took the letter. Perhaps it was only that it was the one thing in that house that was truly Silas's, the one thing that had nothing of Garrett in it. Perhaps it was only that a woman being driven out into the snow with nothing wants to carry one small piece of the life she is losing. She slipped the letter into the inner pocket of her coat against her heart, and she said nothing about it. Then she opened the door. The cold came in like a living thing. It poured over the threshold and filled the warm kitchen and reached for the fire in the stove as if to put it out. Snow swirled in the open doorway, fine and dry and endless, falling from a sky the color of old ash. Behind her in the back room of the house, she could hear nothing. There were no other Hadleys in the valley. No children to say goodbye to. No one to come to the door. Garrett had no wife yet, no family of his own. There was only him standing by the stove, watching her go, and saying nothing more. Cordelia Hadley stepped off the porch into the snow. She did not look back. She had learned over a long life that looking back at a closing door only made it harder to keep walking. So she fixed her eyes on the road ahead, on the white track that led south toward town, and she set her boots into the fresh snow and began to walk. Behind her she heard the door shut. It did not slam. That was what stayed with her. A slammed door would have been honest, would have been anger, would have been something she could understand. But the door shut softly, gently, with a small click of the latch, as if Garrett were being careful not to wake a sleeping child. That soft click followed her down the road longer than the cold did. The walking was hard from the very start. The snow was not deep yet, but it was falling fast, and the wind had begun to gather itself across the open fields the way it always did before a real storm. Cordelia kept to the road as long as she could. The road meant direction. Direction meant purpose. And in the winter, she knew purpose was very nearly the same thing as survival. As long as you were moving towards something, you were not yet lost. She walked with her head down and her shoulders set against the wind. The bread and apples she had wrapped inside the blanket and tied into a bundle she carried under one arm. The other arm she kept tucked against her body for warmth. Her breath came white and quick. Her boots crunched into the snow with each step, and she made herself count those steps. Because counting kept her mind from wandering to the things it wanted to wander to Silas, to the 11 years, to the soft click of the door. She did not let herself think about those things. She thought instead about the cold, because the cold was the thing that would kill her if she let it. And a person who means to live in winter must give the cold her full attention. She knew the cold. She had lived in these mountains for more than a decade, and she had grown up not far from here, and she had buried 2 husbands in this hard country. She knew its tricks. She knew that the cold was patient, that it did not strike like a beast, but crept like water, finding the gaps, settling into the wet places first. She knew that the danger was not the temperature you could feel, but the slow loss of the warmth you could not. She knew that people did not freeze to death because they were cold. They froze because somewhere along the way they stopped being afraid of the cold and let it become comfortable and lay down in it as if into a bed. So she stayed afraid. She kept that fear close like a tool, and she used it to keep her boots moving. But the afternoon wore on and the storm grew worse and the road began to vanish. It happened the way these things always happened in the mountains, not all at once, but in stretches. First, the edges of the road blurred under the drifting snow. Then whole sections disappeared, the white of the road and the white of the field becoming one unbroken sheet. The wind picked up the loose snow and threw it sideways, and the falling snow thickened until she could not see the hills she knew stood on either side of the valley. The world narrowed to the few yards in front of her, a small circle of swirling white, and beyond that, nothing. And then she felt it. The thing she feared more than hunger, more than cold, more than the long miles still ahead. Her boots were wet. She had not noticed it happening, which was how it always happened. The snow had worked its way in over the tops, melting against the warmth of her feet, soaking slowly through the leather and the wool. And now her feet were wet, and the cold was getting into them. And she knew with a clarity that made her stomach drop exactly what that meant. Wet feet in early winter killed people. It killed them slowly, and it killed them long before they understood they were dying. The feet went numb, and then the numbness crept upward, and a person could walk for hours not knowing that their flesh was freezing inside their boots, and by the time they felt it, it was already too late. She stopped. She stood in the swirling snow and made herself think. The town was too far. She knew that now. She had been walking for hours, and she could not have covered more than a few miles in this snow. And the storm was only getting worse, and her feet were wet, and the light was already beginning to fade toward the long blue dark of a winter evening. If she kept on toward town, she would not reach it. She would walk until her strength gave out somewhere on the open road, and she would sit down to rest, and she would not get up. She needed shelter. Not in the morning. Now. And out here on the open road through the valley, there was no shelter at all. Just fields and fences and the long white nothing of the storm. But to the west, beyond the fields, rose the foothills. She turned her head and looked toward them. though she could see nothing through the snow but a deeper shade of gray where the land lifted toward the mountains. She knew those hills. They rose from the valley floor in long, uneven ridges covered in pine and broken stone, and they had always seemed to her a wild and lonely place. Hunters went up there in the autumn after elk, but few people troubled with them once the snow came. There was nothing up there. No farms, no cabins, no reason to climb. But there were trees, and there was stone. And trees and stone could break the wind. It was not much. It was barely a hope at all. But it was more than the open road offered her, and Cordelia Hadley had not survived 63 winters by refusing the small hopes when the large ones had failed. So she left the road. She did it on purpose, deliberately. The way she did everything, turning her back on the buried track that led to town and setting her face toward the hills. It felt like a kind of surrender leaving the road. The road was the known thing, the safe thing, the thing that led to people. The hills were the unknown. But the road was killing her, and the hills at least did not promise anything. And sometimes a thing that promises nothing is more honest than a thing that promises safety it cannot give. The going got harder the moment she left the level ground. The hills rose unevenly, the slope hidden beneath the snow, so that she could not see the rises and dips until she was upon them. Twice she stepped where she thought the ground was level, and found it falling away beneath her. And she pitched forward into the drifts, and had to drag herself up again. Beneath the snow were stones hidden and treacherous, and her boots caught on them and twisted her ankles and bruised her shins. The cold sharpened as she climbed the wind-growing teeth at the higher elevation, driving the snow through the pines in long, glittering waves that caught what little light remained. She climbed anyway. She climbed because stopping was death. She climbed because her feet, which she could no longer fully feel, would not save themselves. She climbed because somewhere deep in her, beneath the exhaustion and the cold and the grief she had not yet let herself feel, there was a thing that would not lie down. A stubbornness. A refusal. The same thing that had carried her through 2 long winters at Silas's bedside. The same thing that had made her drive fence posts into frozen ground and haul water up from an icy creek before dawn. She did not have a name for it. She only knew that she had always had it, and that it had not left her yet even now. But it was fading. She could feel it fading. The cold was working into her past. The fear she had kept close past the stubbornness into the deep places. Her thinking had begun to slow. She noticed it the way you notice a clock that has begun to run down the seconds, stretching the thoughts coming further apart. Her fingers inside her gloves had stopped aching, which she knew was worse than the ache. And there was a temptation rising in her, now soft and terrible, the temptation she had warned herself about her whole life. The temptation to stop, just for a moment. Just to sit down against one of these pines out of the wind and rest. Just to close her eyes for a little while and gather her strength before going on. It would feel so good to rest. The snow looked almost soft now, almost inviting a white bed laid out beneath the trees. She could lie down in it and be warm. She knew in the dim, slow way that was all the thinking she had left, that this was a lie, that the warmth was the last lie the cold told you before it took you. But knowing a thing is a lie does not always stop you from wanting to believe it. She stumbled and caught herself against a tree and stood there, with her cheek against the rough bark, breathing hard. And she thought just for a moment. And it was in that moment, with her face pressed against the pine, and her eyes half closing, and the last of her strength leaking out into the snow, that she saw the line. A straight line. She almost missed it. Her eyes were nearly shut. But something in the corner of her failing vision caught on it, and her mind, slow as it had become, snagged on the wrongness of it. And slowly, painfully, she turned her head to look. A straight line. There in the side of the hill, perhaps 30 paces above her. And to the left, half buried in the snow and tangled with dead brush, there was a straight line where no straight line should have been. Cordelia Hadley had lived her whole life in wild country, and she knew the way only such a person can know, that nature does not make straight lines. The world is made of curves and slopes, and the soft, irregular shapes of growing things. A straight line means a hand. A straight line means a person came once and cut and built and left a mark of purpose on the shapeless land. A straight line in the middle of nowhere, in the side of a hill half a mile from the nearest road, meant something. It meant a door. The thought reached her slowly, and then all at once, and with it came a thin, sharp thread of something she had not felt in hours. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller and harder than hope. Attention. The cold lifted its hand from her mind just for a moment, just enough. She pushed herself off the tree. It took everything she had. Her legs would barely answer her. Her feet were blocks of wood. But she put one of them in front of the other, and then the other in front of that, and she fought her way up the slope toward the straight line, falling twice, dragging herself up twice, until she stood before it. And it was a door. She could hardly believe it, even with her hand reaching out to touch it. But it was real. A thick wooden door, old and weathered gray, set directly into the side of the hill. It was bound with iron straps, darkened by years and built to last, built by someone who had meant it to hold. The snow had drifted heavily against the bottom of it, nearly sealing it shut, and dead brush had grown up around the frame. And there was no path to it, no tracks in the snow, no smoke, no sign that any living soul had passed this way in a very long time. And the hill itself, now that she looked at it properly, was wrong. It was not a natural slope. She could see that now, even through the storm, even through her exhaustion. The ground above the door had been shaped, rounded, deliberately reinforced, built up over something. Someone had taken this hillside and made it into a roof. Someone had hidden something here beneath the earth, and had hidden it so well that the hill had nearly swallowed it back, and the years had nearly erased it, and only the one straight line of the door remained to give it away. Cordelia stood before the door, swaying on her dead feet, and she hesitated, even then, even half frozen with the dark coming down, and the storm screaming through the pines behind her. She hesitated, because a hidden door in a lonely hill could be many things, and not all of them were good. It might be a collapsed shelter, the roof fallen in the inside no warmer than the storm. It might be the den of some animal that had taken it over in the long years of its emptiness. It might be a tomb. It might be nothing, an old root cellar gone to rot, offering no more shelter than a snowdrift. She did not know what was behind that door, but the wind behind her knew its own answer well enough. It rose up the slope and struck her like a fist, and it threw the snow against her back, and it reminded her in the only language the storm knew that there was no other shelter anywhere near enough to matter. Night had come. The cold was in her bones, and whatever lay behind that door, it could not be worse than what lay behind her. So she reached for the handle. The iron burned cold against her palm, even through her glove. A deep aching cold that seemed to pull the last warmth out of her hand. She gripped it. She set her feet as best she could in the drifted snow, and she pulled. The door didn't move. She pulled again, harder, throwing the whole of her diminished weight against it. The snow held it. The years held it. The iron and the wood and the long abandonment held it shut against her. And for one terrible moment she thought it would not open at all, that she would die here on the threshold of shelter. With her hand on the door, the cruelest joke of all, she did not let herself think that. She bent down instead, and with her free hand, she began to dig. She scooped the packed snow away from the base of the door, her dead fingers clumsy and slow, clearing the drift that had sealed it. It took a long time. It felt like it took a lifetime. Her breath sobbed in her throat, and her vision narrowed and grayed at the edges. But she dug and she cleared, and at last she stood and took the handle again in both hands, and she pulled with everything she had left in her body, and everything she had left in her stubborn, unbreakable heart, and the door groaned. It groaned and it shifted, and slowly, grudgingly, it swung inward several inches. And out of that narrow gap came a breath of air, and the air was not warm, but it was still. It was protected. It carried the smell of earth and old wood and a deep, cool quiet, and it was utterly unlike the howling, brutal cold at her back. It was the air of a place the storm could not reach. Cordelia Hadley nearly wept. She did not. There was no time for it, and her body had no tears to spare. But something broke open in her chest. At that breath of still air, some held thing, some braced thing, and for just a moment she had to lean against the doorframe and simply breathe. Then she pulled the door the rest of the way open and looked inside. Darkness, a deeper darkness than the dark of the storm, but she could make out just inside the threshold the top of a flight of stone steps descending into the earth. Stone steps. Cut stone. The work of human hands, careful and deliberate, leading down into the hill. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, past the letter she had taken, and found the small tin she always carried there. Matches. She had kept them dry. A lifetime of living in this country had taught her to always keep her matches dry, and now that habit might be the thing that saved her life. Her fingers shook so badly she dropped the first match. It vanished into the snow at her feet. She steadied her hand against the doorframe and tried again, and the second match caught, flaring up with a small bright hiss, and in its trembling light, she looked down the steps. A passage, timber supports set into the earth like the bones of a mine, dry stone walls. The work of someone who had known what they were doing, who had built not in panic but with skill and patience and care. The matchlight reached only a little way down, but it reached far enough to show her that this was no animal den, no collapsed ruin. This was a made place, a place built by a person for a person to keep a person alive. She did not let herself reconsider. There was no reconsidering left in her anyway. There was only the storm at her back, and the still air ahead only death behind, and the unknown before and between those two. There was no real choice at all. Cordelia Hadley stepped through the doorway into the earth and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. And the storm went silent. It happened all at once. One moment the wind was screaming, tearing at her coat, filling the world with its rage, and the next, with the door closed at her back, there was silence. Not a complete silence, a softer thing. The deep, padded quiet of a place buried beneath the ground, where several feet of earth stood between her and the storm could no longer reach her. It was the quiet of a buried place, the quiet almost of a grave, and yet it was not a grave because she was alive in it, and growing more alive with every breath of that still protected air. She stood on the steps in the dark and let her heart slow. When her hands had steadied enough, she lit another match and she began to descend. The steps were steep, and she took them slowly. One hand pressed against the cold stone wall to keep her balance, the other shielding the small flame from the faint movement of the air. The passage led down, and then leveled, and then opened. And as it opened, the matchlight spread out before her into a larger space. And she lifted the flame, and she saw. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a room A chamber hollowed out of the hill larger than she had any reason to expect. And every wall of it, from the packed earth floor to the timbered ceiling, was lined with shelves, and every shelf held food. For a long moment, Cordelia could not move. She stood at the foot of the steps with the match burning down toward her fingers, and she simply stared, and her mind, slow as it still was from the cold, struggled to take in what her eyes were telling her. Glass jars, rows upon rows of them, sealed and shining in the matchlight, filled with the dark colors of preserved vegetables, beans and beets and greens and things she could not name from here. Sacks of grain, heavy and full, stacked against the lower shelves. Dried herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters overhead, their faint scent threading through the earthy air. Crates of potatoes packed in dry sand. Barrels sealed carefully against the damp stacked in the corners. Apples dried and strung. Salt. Honey. The accumulated careful abundance of someone who had set themselves deliberately and at great labor against the coming of winter. The match burned her fingers and went out. She struck another without thinking, unwilling to lose the sight of it, half afraid that in the dark it would prove to have been a dream. It was not a dream. The light came back, and the food was still there. And there was more. At the center of the chamber stood a small iron stove, squat and black, with a pipe running up from it into the earth of the ceiling, carrying away the smoke through the hillside. Beside the stove was a stack of split wood, dry and ready, covered with a canvas tarp against any moisture. There was tinder near the stove's mouth, and flint and kindling split fine and laid by everything a person would need to make fire, set ready by hands long gone. And against the far wall there was a bunk, a narrow bed built into the stone, layered with folded wool blankets, waiting. Everything in that room spoke of preparation. Not the frantic hoarding of a frightened soul, but the calm, methodical work of someone who had understood winter deeply, who had feared it properly, and who had built against that fear. A place where a person could not merely survive, but live. There was order here. There was purpose. Every jar, every sack, every stick of wood had its place, and its place made sense, and the whole of it together was a kind of answer, a long, patient answer to a hard, cold question. Whoever had built this place had not built it for comfort. They had built it because they understood winter and feared it and refused to be killed by it. Cordelia moved through the room slowly, almost afraid to touch anything, as though she had stumbled into a church or a tomb. Dust lay on some of the surfaces, but not heavily, not the deep dust of true abandonment. Whoever had kept this place had left it, but not so very long ago. A few years, perhaps. Long enough for the brush to grow over the door and the snow to seal it shut, but not so long that the work had gone to ruin. She reached out and touched one of the jars. It was cool and solid under her fingers. She turned it in the matchlight and looked at the seal. Still good. Still tight. She set it down and checked another and another. The grain in the sacks was dry when she pressed her hand into it. The potatoes, when she dug into the sand, showed no rot. The food was real and the food was good, and there was enough of it, she understood with a slowly dawning wonder, to keep a person alive for months, through the whole of a winter and beyond. Set down here in the earth beneath the hill, waiting the way you might set aside something precious, and then forget it like buried mercy. The thought of it nearly overwhelmed her. An hour ago, perhaps less, she had been dying. She had been a few stumbling steps from becoming another of the valley's quiet winter tragedies, the kind people spoke of in low voices when the spring came and the bodies were found. An old woman, they would have said, cast out and lost in the storm. A sad thing, and they would have shaken their heads, and they would have been right. And that would have been the end of Cordelia Hadley. And instead, she was here, in a room full of food and the means to make fire, in the one place, in all these wild hills, where a person might be saved. She sat down. Her legs simply would not hold her any longer, and she sat down heavily on the edge of the stone bunk. And she closed her eyes, and for one long moment she let herself feel all of it. The grief and the cold and the cruelty and the fear, the soft click of a door and the long walk into the storm, the dying and the not dying. She let it move through her like a wave, and she did not fight it, and she did not let it carry her under. And then she opened her eyes, because she was Cordelia Hadley, and there was work to do. Shelter first, fire second, feeling last of all when there was room for it. She had learned that order over a long, hard life, and it had never once failed her. She lit the third match against the kindling laid ready in the stove. The tinder caught fine and dry, and she fed the small flame carefully, the way she had fed 10,000 fires before this one, coaxing it, sheltering it, building it slowly, so that it would not gutter and die. The kindling caught, then the smaller pieces of split wood, and then as the fire took hold and grew strong, she opened the iron door wider and laid in 2 of the larger pieces from the stack beside the stove. For a moment she watched the smoke, anxious. A stove was no good to her if it would not draw, if the smoke backed up into the room and choked her. She had heard of people dying that way in sealed places, killed by their own fires. But the smoke pulled upward at once, clean and steady, drawn up through the pipe and out through the hillside above. Good draft, good design. Whoever had built this place had understood that too, had understood that a fire underground needed somewhere for its breath to go, and had built the pipe to carry it away. The fire burned clean, and the air stayed sweet, and Cordelia let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Warmth began to spread through the chamber. It was not a dramatic warmth. It did not roar up and fill the room the way a fire fills a cabin. It came slowly, gently, steadily, the way everything in this buried place seemed to happen. But it was warmth, real warmth, living warmth. And as it reached her, she felt her body begin very slowly to come back to itself. She took off her boots first. This was the most important thing, and she knew it. Her feet, when she finally got the wet leather off them, were white and waxen and frightening to look at, and she could not feel them at all. She held them out toward the stove, not too close, never too close, because she knew that to warm frozen flesh too fast was to destroy it. She warmed them slowly the way she did everything, and after a long while the feeling began to return, and with it came pain, a deep burning ache as the blood found its way back into the dying tissue. She welcomed the pain. The pain meant the flesh was alive. The pain meant she would keep her feet, and a woman who keeps her feet can keep on living. While her feet warmed, she peeled off her wet gloves and her coat, heavy now, with melted snow, and she hung them near the stove to dry. Water dripped from them onto the packed earth floor and steamed gently in the heat. She wrapped one of the wool blankets from the bunk around her shoulders, and she sat in the growing warmth. And for the first time in many hours, she was not afraid she was going to die. When at last she felt steady enough, she rose and went to the shelves, and she took down a jar at random. Preserved beans by the look of them. The seal gave way under her stiff fingers with a soft sound, and the smell that rose up was ordinary and good. She had no spoon, so she ate with her fingers sitting beside the stove, and the beans were cold and plain and entirely without flavor. And they were the finest thing she had ever eaten in her life. That was the part she could not have explained to anyone, the plainness of it, the sheer ordinariness of cold beans from a jar. In the world above, in the life that had ended that afternoon, such a thing would have been nothing, would have been beneath noticing. But here now, with the storm raging unheard beyond several feet of earth, and her own death so recently behind her, the ordinary food was almost more than she could bear. because that was the truth she had learned. The truth the cold had taught her on the hillside, that ordinary things become precious the moment survival enters the room. A jar of beans, a dry blanket, a door that opens. The whole of a life she thought was made of ordinary things, and you never knew their worth until the moment they were nearly taken from you. She ate slowly. She made herself stop before she was full, because she did not yet know how long this food might need to last her, and a lifetime of hard winters had taught her to ration, even in the midst of plenty. She sealed the jar again and set it back on its shelf. The fire burned low, and she fed it again. The warmth had spread fully through the chamber now, a steady, gentle heat, and the lantern she had found and lit cast its soft yellow light across the earth. Packed walls, and the laden shelves and the hanging herbs. The storm above was a distant thing, a faint occasional shudder of the upper door when the wind struck it hardest. Nothing more. Down here, there was only the warmth and the light and the food and the quiet. Cordelia sat in the midst of it all and looked around her, slowly taking the measure of the place that had saved her. This place had not been built for comfort. She understood that now more deeply than she had at first. It had been built by someone who understood winter the way she had come to understand it on that hillside. Someone who had looked the cold in the face and seen it clearly, and who had answered it not with hope or prayer but with labor and stone and the patient hoarding of food against the dark months. It had been built by someone who feared winter properly, and because they had feared it properly, they had survived it. And because they had survived it and stored away more than they could ever need, and then gone away and not come back, a dying old woman cast out into the snow had found beneath the hill a thing she had no right to expect. She did not yet know whose work this was. She did not yet know the name that would soon mean so much to her, or the strange thread that ran from a faded letter in her coat pocket to the very stones around her. She did not yet know that the man who had built this place was bound to her by more than chance, nor that the food on these shelves would, before the winter was through, mean the difference between life and death for more souls than her own. She did not yet know that the soft click of a closing door was not the end of her story, but the beginning of it. She knew only that she was warm and alive and that the storm could not reach her here. And so when at last the long, terrible day caught up with her body and her eyes grew heavy in the lantern light, Cordelia Hadley lay down on the narrow bunk beneath the warm wool blankets of a man she had never met, in a shelter built against the very death that had come for her that afternoon. And she pulled the blanket to her chin, and she listened to the distant shudder of the storm against the upper door, and she felt the steady warmth of the little iron stove holding the cold at bay. She thought, just before sleep took her, of the letter in her coat, of the name Silas had spoken once sadly on a quiet evening long ago. August. A man who had lived up on the hill. But she was too tired to chase the thought, and it slipped away from her down into the dark to wait for the morning. And Cordelia Hadley cast out before the first snow with nothing but bread, and a blanket slept her first night beneath the hill in the warmth of buried mercy, while the storm howled itself out against the unmoving earth above her, and the long winter settled down in earnest over the valley she had been driven from, and the door she had pulled shut behind her, held fast against the cold. Cordelia Hadley woke before dawn to the sound of silence, not the empty silence of an abandoned place, a protected silence, the deep padded quiet that comes only when several feet of earth stand between a person and the winter, when the storm has been shut out so completely that it ceases for a little while to be real. For one long moment she did not know where she was. She lay still beneath the wool blankets, her eyes open in the dimness, and her mind reached out for the familiar shape of her room above the kitchen. for the slope of the ceiling she had looked at every morning for 11 years for the cold gray light that would be coming through the window. And she found none of it. The ceiling above her was wrong. It curved. Timber beams crossed it, set into packed earth, and somewhere to her left a faint orange glow breathed in the dark. Then it came back to her, all of it in a single quiet rush. The kitchen, the bread and the apples and the folded blanket. The soft click of the door, the long walk into the storm, the straight line in the side of the hill, and the room full of food buried beneath the earth, the buried mercy that had taken her in. She had not dreamed it. The orange glow was the stove. The fire had survived the night. She had banked it before sleep the way she had banked 1,000 fires, and it had held. And the small iron stove had kept its steady, patient warmth through all the dark hours, while the storm screamed itself hoarse against the hill above. The fire had survived the night. And so had she. That thought alone nearly brought her to tears. She had walked out of that house expecting to die. She had felt death's hand on her, on the hillside, had felt the cold reaching into the center of her, had felt the terrible soft temptation to lie down in the snow. And instead, she had woken in warmth beneath blankets alive. There were not many mornings in a long life that a person could call a second chance. And Cordelia knew, lying there in the dark, that this was one of them. She did not weep. There was no time for it, and besides, weeping had never been her way. Instead, she sat up carefully on the narrow bunk and she took stock. The shelter was cool but stable. That was the first thing she noticed, and the more she thought on it, the more remarkable it became. Above her, the storm still raged. She could hear it now that she was listening for it, a deep, distant rushing, the occasional shudder of the upper door when the wind struck it hardest. The world up there would be a killing place this morning, the temperature far below anything a body could endure for long. And yet down here in the chamber, the cold had not advanced. No frost lined the walls. No wind found its way through any crack. When she rose and went to the water bucket she had filled the night before from a covered barrel, she found only the thinnest skin of ice on its surface, a film she broke with one touch of her finger. The hill itself was holding the temperature steady. She stood there a moment, turning that over in her mind. A cabin would not have done this. She knew cabins. She had lived in them all her life. In a cabin on a morning like this, the water bucket would be frozen solid. Frost would feather the inside of every window and creep along the seams of every wall, and a body would wake to find its breath hanging white in the air and the fire all but useless against the cold pressing in from every side. The wind would find the gaps. The cold would reach every wall. That was the nature of a house built up in the open air where the weather could get at it from all directions at once. But here, beneath the hill, the cold could only come from one direction, the door, and the door was shut. And the earth all around her, the deep, packed earth of the hillside, held its temperature, the way a great stone holds the warmth of the sun long after the sun is set. The ground changed slowly, far more slowly than the air. And so, while the world above swung wildly between the brutal cold of the storm and whatever brief mercy the daylight brought down here in the earth, the temperature held nearly even cool and steady and survivable. It was, she thought, the most sensible thing she had ever encountered. And she wondered, not for the first time, at the mind that had understood it well enough to build all this. She fed 2 pieces of wood into the stove and watched the fire catch them quickly, eagerly. Dry wood. That mattered more than a person who had never been desperate could ever know. Wet wood smoked and hissed and gave grudging heat. Dry wood gave its warmth freely. And every stick in the covered stack beside the stove was dry, kept dry through years of abandonment by the canvas tarp and the steady dryness of the buried air. Nothing here was an accident. She was beginning to understand that. Everything in this place had been thought through, prepared, set in order by a mind that took winter seriously. She spent the morning learning the shelter properly. She moved through it slowly with the patient thoroughness that had been her habit all her life, taking the measure of each thing, committing it to memory. And the more she looked, the more there was to find. There were more supplies than she had understood the night before. Far more. Behind a hanging cloth she had taken for a curtain, she found another bank of shelves, these laden with preserves she had not seen, jars of fruit and pickled things and dark jams. There were small bins of dried apples, withered and sweet, and beans of several kinds and lentils. There was salt, a great deal of it wrapped carefully in waxed paper, to keep the damp from it. There was honey in sealed crocks. There was even tea dried and stored in a tin. And the small, unexpected luxury of it made something tighten in her throat. Deeper in the hill past the main chamber, she found a second alcove she had missed entirely in the dark. It was a storage room smaller than the first, and in it stood barrels of grain raised up off the floor on flat stones, so that no moisture from the ground could reach them and spoil what they held. She pried the lid from one and found it full of wheat, dry and clean and good. She stood looking at it for a long moment in the lantern light. Whoever had built this place had not merely stored food. They had understood how food spoiled and had built against every way of spoiling the damp and the cold and the rot and the vermin, and had defeated each of them in turn with stone and sand and wax and care. Whoever had built this place had understood survival completely. It was near the rear wall of that second alcove, tucked onto a high shelf, where she might easily have missed it, that she found the ledger. It was a thick book, bound in leather, gone stiff and cracked with age, and when she took it down and opened it, she half expected the pages to crumble in her hands. But they did not. The buried dryness that had kept the grain good had kept the paper good as well, and the pages, though yellowed, were whole, and the ink upon them, though faded, was clear. She carried the ledger back to the stove and sat down with it in the lantern light, and she began to read. The hand was a man's, square and careful, the writing of someone who had not been to a great deal of school, but who had learned to set his thoughts down plainly and to make them count. And most of what he had set down was practical, the daily arithmetic of survival. Wood remaining counted in cords and marked off as it was burned. Food used jar by jar, sack by sack. A careful tally so that he might always know how long his stores would last. Temperatures recorded morning and night through the long winters, the cold above and the steadier cool below, set side by side so the difference between them could be seen at a glance. How long the potatoes lasted before they sprouted. How long the carrots kept in the sand. Which jars spoiled and which held, and why. It was the record of a man learning his own survival, the way a scholar learns a subject by long, patient observation, by writing it down, by refusing to trust to memory or luck what he could instead set down in ink and know for certain. And scattered between the numbers here and there were other things, explanations, the thoughts of the man behind the figures, built after the frieze of '68, one entry read, and below it a cabin fails because the weather reaches every wall. The ground changes slower than the air. Build into the ground and the cold has only one way in. Cordelia stopped reading and sat very still. There it was. The whole secret of the place set down in a few plain words by the man who had discovered it. She had worked it out for herself that morning, standing over the unfrozen water bucket. But he had worked it out years before, her worked it out from grief and fear and a hard winter, and had built his understanding into the very hill around her. The ground changes slower than the air. She turned the words over in her mind. They seemed to her just then very nearly the truest words she had ever read. She read on, and as she read, the figures and the practical notes began to assemble themselves page by page into the shape of a life, a man's life. The man who had built this place. His name she found at last written on the inside of the front cover. In that same square, careful hand was August Reed. The name went through her like a cold draft through a closing door. August. She set the ledger down in her lap and reached slowly into the inner pocket of the coat that hung drying by the stove. Her fingers found the letter she had taken from Silas's box. The old letter, the paper soft with handling, and the ink faded to brown. She drew it out and unfolded it with great care, for it was fragile, and she held it close to the lantern, and she read it for the first time. She had never read it before. It had been Silas's, his private thing, and she had respected his silence about it while he lived. But Silas was dead now, and she was alive beneath this hill. And the man who had written the letter, and the man who had built this shelter, bore the same name, and she could no longer respect a silence that the dead had taken with them. The letter was short. It was a hard letter. The kind a man writes when he has been wronged and means to say so, but has not the heart to be cruel about it. It spoke of land. It spoke of a boundary and a survey and a deed, and a thing the Hadley family had done long ago in the years before Cordelia, in the years even before Silas was an old man. It spoke of a man pushed off the land that should have been his, the good bottomland of the valley, and left with only the high broken hills where nothing would grow and no one would farm. And it was signed at the bottom in that same square, careful hand she had been reading all morning. August Reed. She lowered the letter and looked around the chamber at the laden shelves and the earth-packed walls and the small iron stove, and she understood all at once where she was. This was Reed's place. The man Silas had wronged, or whom the Hadleys had wronged, the man pushed off the good land and up into the worthless hills. The man who had written that sad, hard letter, and whom Silas had never been able to forget, and whose name Silas had spoken only once softly on a quiet evening with grief in his voice. August Reed had been driven up into these hills by Cordelia's own husband's family, the same family that had now driven her out into the snow. And up here in the broken, worthless ground he had been left. With August Reed had built the thing that had saved her life. She was bound to this place. She had stumbled into it half dead, and by the purest chance, and yet she was bound to it, bound by a thread of old wrong and old blood that ran straight from the letter in her hands to the stones around her. The land Garrett Hadley meant to sell to the railroad, the land he had cast her out to keep, was the same land that had been taken from August Reed, and the shelter that would keep her alive through the winter Garrett had hoped would kill her was the shelter that wronged man had built with his own hands in the only ground the family had left him. It was almost too much to take in. She sat with it a long while, the ledger in her lap and the letter in her hand, the fire ticking in the stove, the storm a distant rushing far above. Buried mercy, she had thought it the night before. She had not known how right she was. The mercy was buried in more than earth. It was buried in the past, in an old injustice, in the patient labor of a wronged man who could not have known that the kindness he was building into the hill would one day reach down the years to save a woman married into the very family that had wronged him. She turned back to the ledger and read on more slowly now, with a new and aching attention, for these were not the words of a stranger any longer. The story they told was a sad one. August Reed had lost his family in a hard winter decades back. The freeze of '68 that the early entries spoke of. A wife she gathered and children, though he never named them, and never said plainly what had happened, only that the cold had taken them. and that a cabin had not been enough to hold it off. And out of that grief, out of that fear, he had built this place. Not a home. A home was a thing you built for living, full of light and openness and welcome. This was a thing built against death, a buried reserve, a fortress against the one enemy that had already beaten him once, and that he had sworn would not beat him again. He had spent years on it. The ledger showed digging and shoring and stocking and refining, learning its lessons one winter at a time, until he had made of this broken hillside a place where the cold could not reach him. And then, 6 years before, the entries simply stopped. She found the last of them near the back of the ledger, and she read it 3 times, and each time it struck her harder. Snow coming earlier than expected this year. The last entry read, "Going down into the valley tomorrow for lamp oil and flour. Back by dark." And then nothing. The rest of the pages were blank. Back by dark. But he had not come back. Whatever had happened to August Reed, it had happened in the valley or on the road, on a day 6 winters gone when the snow had come earlier than he expected. He had gone down for lamp oil and flour, the smallest and most ordinary of errands, and he had never returned to the shelter he had spent years perfecting. And the brush had grown over the door, and the snow had sealed it shut, and the hill had nearly taken it back, until a dying old woman had found the one straight line he had left in the world and pulled the door open at last. Cordelia closed the ledger gently, and she sat for a long time in the lantern light, and she thought about the strange and terrible chain of things that had brought her to this place. A hidden shelter, a wronged man's careful preparation, a storm arriving on the very afternoon she lost her home, a letter she had taken on an impulse she could not name that turned out to hold the key to everything. It was too much to be chance, and yet it was nothing but chance, and she did not know what to make of it. And so in the end, she made nothing of it at all. She only sat and remembered August Reed, a man she had never met, and felt a grief for him that surprised her with its sharpness. He had built a place to keep the winter out, and the winter had taken him anyway on an ordinary errand, far from the safety he had made. There was a hard lesson in that, she thought, though she could not yet say what it was. By afternoon, the storm above had grown worse. She could hear it through the earth now, a deepening rush and roar, and from time to time the upper door shuddered hard in its frame as the wind threw itself against the hill. Curious and a little uneasy, she set the ledger aside and climbed the stone steps to the door and pushed it open, just a few inches to see what the world had become. What she saw stopped her breath. The world beyond the door had vanished into white. There was no valley, no hills, no sky, no line where the earth ended and the air began. There was only the storm, a single howling whiteness that swallowed everything. The drifts had risen against the hillside until they buried the brush entirely, and the snow swept past the doorway sideways in long, violent ribbons driven by a wind that nearly tore the door from her hand. She could see perhaps 20 yards. Beyond that, nothing. The pines that stood close by were gray ghosts, half erased. The ones further off were not there at all. No one was reaching the town in this. No one should even try. A person caught out in this would last minutes, not hours. She thought of August Reed going down for lamp oil and flour on a day the snow came early, and she shivered. And it was not from the cold. She drew the door shut again and sealed it carefully, packing the gap at its base, and went back down into the warmth. That evening, as she sat by the stove and made her plain supper, she noticed another thing about the shelter, a smaller thing than the great lesson of the steady earth, but one that struck her nonetheless. The air down here remained dry. In an ordinary cabin in a cold like this, the air grew wet. Frost gathered on the walls and the windows, and when the fire warmed the room, the frost melted, and everything grew damp, and the damp got into the bedding and the food and the very bones of a person. until they could not get warm, no matter how high they built the fire. But here, the earth absorbed the changes slowly, and the dryness held. The potatoes in their sand stayed firm and unfrozen. The bread she had brought, what little was left of it, did not turn to stone all at once, but hardened slowly, gently over days. The buried structure moderated the extremes of the world, above smoothed them, gentled them, made them survivable. That was the secret, she thought again. Not warmth, not really. The stove gave warmth. The secret of the hill was steadiness. The hill refused to let the world change too fast. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days she spent beneath the hill alone, learning the rhythms of the place, tending the fire, eating sparingly, reading and rereading August Reed's ledger, until she felt she had known the man. She kept careful track of the wood she burned and the food she ate, marking it down in the back of the ledger, in her own hand beneath his, because it seemed right to her to keep up his record, to carry on the careful counting he had begun. She slept and woke, and could not always tell the day from the night so far beneath the earth, and measured the passing of time by the storm's slow weakening, which she could hear faintly far above. On the 5th morning she heard the knocking. She was at the stove when it came, and at first she did not believe it. It was a weak sound, uneven, easily mistaken for the storm, and she told herself it was the wind or the settling of the snow, or her own mind playing tricks on her after 4 days of solitude. But then it came again. A knocking. A human knocking knuckles on wood, faltering and faint on the upper door. Cordelia set down what she held and climbed the steps slowly, her heart loud in her chest. She did not know who could possibly be at that door in this country after such a storm. She opened it a few inches, bracing it against the wind. A woman stood outside. She was old, near Cordelia's own age, and she was half buried in snow, the drifts up past her knees, her shawl crusted white, and her lips cracked and blue. And beside her, holding to her skirts, his small face gray with cold, stood a boy of perhaps 8 years. "We saw smoke," the woman said. Her voice was a ruin scraped raw by the cold. "Thought maybe hunters." For a moment, Cordelia could only stare. Then everything in her that had kept other people alive her whole long life took hold of her at once, and she threw the door wide. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. Quickly now." The boy nearly fell on the steps. Cordelia caught him and half carried him down into the warmth, the woman stumbling behind, and the moment the heat of the chamber reached them, both stopped dead, swaying their bodies, seizing on the warmth, the way a drowning person seizes on air. It was not a hot warmth. It was a living warmth, the kind that lets frozen hands work again, the kind that brings the blood back to gray flesh. And it took them both like a blow. The woman stared around the chamber at the shelves of food glowing in the lantern light, at the steady stove, at the earth-packed walls, and her cracked lips moved. "What?" she whispered. "What is this place?" Cordelia got the boy onto the bunk and wrapped him in blankets and looked up at the old woman, and she found that the answer came to her plainly, as though she had known it a long time. "A place built for the winters people fear," she said. The woman's name was Mrs. Whitlock, and the boy was her grandson Eli. They had been alone in their cabin at the valley's far edge when the storm came, the boy's parents away in the town and trapped there by the closing of the pass. Their woodpile had run low. The cabin had grown so cold that the water froze a foot from the stove, and Mrs. Whitlock had understood with the clear, hard knowledge of the old that they would not last another night. And then, in a brief lull in the storm, she had seen smoke rising from a hillside where no smoke should be, a thin gray thread against the white. and she had wrapped the boy up and made the desperate walk toward it, not knowing what she would find, knowing only that to stay was to die. The smoke from August Reed's stovepipe, drawn up clean through the hill, had reached out across the storm and called them in. Cordelia fed them. She gave them broth she made by warming water and the preserved beans together over the stove, and bread softened in the broth. And she made them eat slowly, a little at a time, because she knew what too much food too fast did to a starved and frozen body. She warmed Mrs. Whitlock's feet, as she had warmed her own, slowly, never too close to the fire. She held the boy's hands in hers until the gray went out of them and the color came back. And all the while the two of them looked at her and at the shelter with the dazed wonder of people who had walked out of their own deaths and into something they could not understand. That was how it began. By evening, two more had come. They came the same way Mrs. Whitlock had come, drawn by the smoke. The storm had broken at last into a clear, hard cold, and across the valley people emerged from their freezing cabins to find their world transformed and their situation desperate. And some of them, looking toward the hills, saw the impossible thread of smoke rising from the snow-buried slope and came to find its source. A man named Coombs and his grown son, their own cabin half collapsed under the snow load, came stumbling up through the drifts at dusk, following the tracks the others had left. And Cordelia took them in. And the next day another family came, and the day after that, two more souls, until the buried chamber that August Reed had built. For one held more people than it had ever been meant to hold. And Cordelia Hadley found herself at the center of it. She had not asked for this. She had asked for nothing but to survive. And she had nearly not gotten even that. And now here she was, an old woman cast out of her own home with bread and a blanket, standing in a dead man's shelter with a dozen frightened, freezing people looking to her to keep them alive. She did not hesitate. That was not her way. She had spent her whole life keeping other people alive, husbands and livestock, and a house full of work. And she fell into it now as naturally as breathing. She organized the shelter. She rationed the food, dividing it evenly, making the careful count. August Reed had taught her, marking down each jar and sack as it was opened, so that she would always know how long the stores would last and how thin she dared to spread them. She set the strongest of the newcomers to gathering more wood from the dead stands of pine nearby in the brief, safe hours of daylight, and she had it stacked by dryness, the driest closest to the stove, the green wood set aside to season. She watched the water melting snow in the covered barrel and rationing it as carefully as the food. And twice each day, morning and night, she checked the ventilation, the drawer of the stovepipe and the gap at the door, because she knew from the ledger and from her own hard sense that a sealed place full of people and a burning fire could turn deadly without warning if the air went bad. The place worked because everything in it served a purpose. She understood that now deeply, the way August Reed had understood it. Storage and heat and air and protection, each thing answering a need, nothing there by accident. And under her hand, the shelter that had been built for one stretched to hold many, not in comfort, never in comfort, but in survival, which in that winter was worth more than comfort could ever be. The valley, she learned from the people who came to her, was suffering badly. It came to her in pieces in the low, exhausted talk of the people gathered around her stove. Several cabins had drifted nearly shut. The snow piled to the eaves, the people inside digging tunnels just to reach their woodpiles. The wood itself was the great trouble. Much of it had been cut green or left out in the weather, and it smoked and hissed and gave no proper heat, so that people burned through their stores twice as fast as they should have, and still could not get warm. One family had lost the better part of their winter food. When the roof of their storage shed gave way under the weight of the snow and crushed and buried everything beneath it. The valley, she came to understand, was full of people who had built their lives in the open air in cabins that the cold reached through every wall, with food stored where the weather could get at it, and the winter was punishing them all for it hard. And beneath the hill, meanwhile, the supplies held, not endlessly. She was too careful a woman to let anyone, including herself, believe the food would never run out. But it held steady and controlled the way everything in that place held steady. And it held because a wronged and grieving man had understood decades ago the thing the valley was only now learning at the cost of its comfort and nearly its life. It was on the second evening after the storm broke that she found the thing that troubled her. She had been deep in the second alcove, taking a fuller count of the grain than she had managed before, with so many mouths now to feed. And as she worked her way along the lower shelves, moving sacks to see what lay behind them, her hand fell on a place where the dust was wrong. She stopped. She had a feel for the place now after a week of living in it. She knew where the dust lay thick and undisturbed and where her own hands had cleared it. And here, in a low corner of the alcove behind a stack of grain sacks, was a patch of shelf where the dust had been disturbed, and not by her. Smeared, brushed aside, as though a hand had reached in there recently and moved something and set it back not quite straight. And the wood. She had been keeping the count of the wood as August Reed had taught her, and now that she thought of it, the count had troubled her from the start. Only she had been too busy keeping people alive to pay it proper mind. The stack had stood lower than the ledger said it ought to, by a fair amount, as though someone had taken wood from it more than a little in the years since August Reed's last entry. As though someone had been here in this shelter since the man who built it failed to come home. Cordelia stood very still in the lantern light, and the warmth of the place seemed for a moment to recede. She had thought the shelter abandoned. She had told herself that whoever built it had gone away and never returned. And she had grieved for August Reed, and she had believed herself the first soul to open that door in 6 long years. The brush over the door, the snow sealing it shut, the deep, undisturbed quiet of the place. When she came, all of it had told her she was alone in a forgotten place. But the dust said otherwise. The wood count said otherwise. Someone had been here, not long ago. Someone knew about this shelter, knew of its existence, knew the way to the straight line in the side of the hill, and had come and taken what they wanted, and gone again, leaving the brush to grow and the snow to seal the door so that no one would guess they knew. Someone in the valley knew about August Reed's shelter, and whoever it was had wanted it kept secret. She thought of the railroad survey on Silas's old desk. She thought of the careful lawyer's hand, and the list of names, and the word heir. She thought of Garrett Hadley's sliding eyes, and of all the land the Hadley family had taken over the years, the good bottomland that had once been August Reed's. And she felt the first cold edge of an understanding she did not yet want to have. She told no one of what she had found. There was no sense frightening people who were only just beginning to feel safe. But she watched after that. She watched the door and the count of the food and the count of the wood. And she kept the ledger close, and she waited because she did not know yet what she was waiting for, only that it was coming. It came on the second evening near full dark, with a knock that was not the weak, faltering knock of the desperate. It was a single hard rap, and then the door was pushed open from outside before anyone could rise to answer it. And a man came down the stone steps into the chamber, stamping the snow from his boots, his eyes moving quickly across the gathered people and the laden shelves and the steady stove. He was young, perhaps 30, lean and weathered, with the look of a man who knew these hills and had tracked his way through them. Cordelia knew him. She had seen him in the valley in better days. His name was Thaddeus Kearney, and he had been there. She remembered now with a strange small jolt on the morning Garrett had cast her out. He had been at the edge of the yard that day on some errand of his own, and he had seen her go, and he had said nothing, and she had not blamed him for it for what was there to say. He saw her now across the warm, crowded chamber, and his face changed. He had not expected to find her here. He had not expected to find her anywhere she understood except dead in a drift somewhere on the road to town. The shame of that moved across his face plainly. The memory of the morning he had watched a thing happen and done nothing, and to his credit he did not look away from it the way Garrett Hadley always looked away. "You're alive," he said. "I am," said Cordelia. His eyes moved again around the chamber, taking in the food and the people, the order of the place. The work of her hand laid over the work of August Reed's. "You've been living here," he said, "all this time, while we all thought—" He stopped. "Surviving here," Cordelia said. "There's a difference." He came down the last of the steps, slowly, and then he told her why he had come. And as he spoke, the cold understanding she had been holding off all evening settled fully into her at last. He had come, he said, because of Garrett Hadley. Garrett had been busy in the town in the days since the pass had reopened between storms. He had been with the lawyer. He had been filing papers, claims, signing documents, working to put his name on land, and not only the Hadley farm, on the whole of the hills above the valley, the broken, worthless hills that no one had ever wanted, that no one farmed, that everyone had forgotten, and that Garrett Hadley was now quietly and with great speed working to make entirely his own. The railroad survey ran through them. The railroad would pay for a clear title, and Garrett meant to hold that title alone, every acre of it, and to clear off anything and anyone that stood upon it. Including Thaddeus Kearney, set his eyes on the gathered people in the warm, bright chamber. The families who had taken refuge in this shelter when the storm and the cold drove them from their homes. He had come to warn them. Word had reached the town of smoke rising from the hills, of people sheltering in some hidden place up the slope, and Garrett had heard it, and Garrett was not pleased. For the hills were to be his, and he wanted no claim of any kind. No squatters, no shelter, no story of refuge that might cloud his title or stir the valley against him. He meant, when the weather allowed, to come up and clear them out, to put every soul in that chamber back out into the snow so that the land beneath them might be sold clean. A long silence followed when he finished. The people around the stove looked at one another, the relief of the past days draining from their faces, the old fear coming back into their eyes. They had been driven from their homes by the winter, and they had found against all hope a place of safety in the earth. And now they learned that a man in the town meant to drive them from this too, out into the very cold they had only just escaped, so that he might sell the ground over their heads to the railroad. Cordelia Hadley stood among them, an old woman in a dead man's shelter, and she looked from face to face. And then she looked at the shelves of food August Reed had stored against the winter he feared, in the only ground the Hadleys had left him. And she felt something settle in her, hard and cold and clear. She had been cast out once already this winter with bread and a blanket and told to disappear. She had walked into the storm and very nearly done it. She would not be cast out twice. And she would not let it be done to these people either, the ones who had followed the smoke to her door, the ones she had warmed back to life with her own hands. She did not say any of this aloud. She was not a woman who said such things aloud. But Thaddeus Kearney, watching her face in the lantern light, saw something cross it, and whatever it was, it made him stand a little straighter, and made the frightened people around the stove go quiet and turn toward her, as people in trouble will always turn toward the one among them who is not afraid. "Let him come," was all Cordelia said. And outside, far above the buried chamber, the wind began to rise again over the hills, and the gray sky thickened toward another storm. And somewhere down in the valley, a man named Garrett Hadley was signing his name to land that had never truly been his, never knowing that the woman he had thrown away to get it was waiting for him beneath the snow in the one place in all that country where the cold could not reach. Growing stronger by the day in the shelter a wronged man had built, the trouble came not from the valley below, but from the sky above, and it came first. For 3 days after Thaddeus Carney brought his warning, the weather held the world hostage. A second storm settled over the valley heavier than the first, and it shut the pass and buried the roads and made any movement up the hills or down them a thing no sane person would attempt. Garrett Hadley could not come up to clear them out, not yet, not while the storm raged. And that should have been a mercy. But the same snow that kept Garrett away brought a different danger down upon them, and it was Cordelia who saw it first. It began with the food. She had been counting carefully from the start, the way August Reed had taught her, the way her own long life had taught her. And the count had been steady controlled, a thing she could hold in her mind and trust. But the shelter had been built for one man, and now it sheltered 14 souls and 14 mouths, empty the shelves of a single man's winter at a speed that no care could fully slow. She had rationed hard. She had spread the food as thin as she dared. But on the morning of the 3rd day, sitting with the ledger and the lantern light, she made the count again and felt her stomach drop. It was going faster than she had let herself believe. The storm had trapped them, and trapping them, it had stopped the gathering of wood and the hunting of game and the slow trickle of supplies that some of the families had brought up from their half-buried homes. There was no longer anything coming in. There was only what was on the shelves, and what was on the shelves divided 14 ways would not see them through to the spring. She had told herself and the others that the supplies would hold, and they had held for one. They would not hold for 14, not all the way through a winter that showed no sign of breaking. She did the arithmetic 3 times, hoping each time to have made some error. She had not. Set against 14 people and a winter still in its teeth, the buried abundance that had seemed so vast to her on that first desperate night was, she now understood, a finite and dwindling thing. She told no one at first. She only cut the rations again quietly and set the strongest to risking the storm in its briefest lulls to bring up what little food remained in the buried cabins below. And she watched the shelves grow thinner and said nothing and carried the weight of it alone, because that was what she had always done. And then the boy fell ill. Eli, Mrs. Whitlock's grandson, the child who had nearly collapsed on the steps that first day. He had come back to life in the warmth of the shelter, had even begun to play in the grave, careful way of a child who has been frightened among the grain barrels in the back alcove. But on the 3rd night of the 2nd storm, he grew quiet and then hot, and by morning he was burning with fever, his small body shaking his breath, coming fast and shallow and wet. Mrs. Whitlock knelt beside him on the bunk and did not weep, because she was old and hard like Cordelia and had buried people before. But her face in the lantern light was the face of a woman watching the last of her family slip toward the dark. The boy's parents were trapped in the town beyond the closed pass. There was no doctor within 15 impossible miles. There was only the fever and the storm and the thinning shelves and a chamber full of frightened people in the earth. Cordelia knelt on the other side of the bunk and put her hand to the boy's forehead and felt the heat coming off him. And she understood that she was now caught between 2 deaths. The fever which wanted the boy, and the winter which wanted them all, and the food running out beneath them like sand through a glass. It was the worst night of her life, and she had buried 2 husbands. She did not sleep. She sat by the boy through the long, dark hours, cooling his face with snowmelt, spooning warm broth between his cracked lips when he could take it, doing the small, useless, tender things that are all a person can do against a fever, when there is no medicine and no doctor, and no help coming. She had nursed Silas through 2 winters of dying. She knew this work. She knew, too, its limits, knew that the body either turned the corner on its own, or it did not, and that she could do little but keep the boy warm and watered and not alone, and wait to see which way it would go. And while she waited, she made her decision about the food, for the boy needed strength to fight the fever more than a child's ration could give him, and the others needed strength to endure. And there was not enough for both, not at the rate they were going, not with the winter so far from spent. She would have to choose. She would have to take from the many to give to the one, or hold to the even count and let the boy fight the fever on a starveling share. And either choice was a kind of cruelty, and there was no clean way through it. She chose the boy. She did it openly in the morning, standing before all of them in the lantern light with the ledger in her hand. She told them the truth, the whole of it, the count and the rate and the long winter still to come. She did not soften it. They were grown people, most of them hard valley people who had known want before, and they deserved the truth. And then she told them what she meant to do, that she would give the boy a sick child's full need, and that the difference would come from the rest of them, from every share, including her own, which would be cut to nearly nothing, that they would all be hungrier so that the boy might have a chance. She braced herself for anger. She would not have blamed them for it. Hungry people, frightened people are not always kind, and there were those among them, the man Coombs chief among them, who had families of their own to think of, children of their own, and who might well have argued that a stranger's grandchild was not worth their own children's portion. But no one argued. They looked at the boy on the bunk, burning and small, and they looked at the old woman who had pulled every one of them in out of the snow and warmed them back to life with her own hands, and they did not argue. Coombs only nodded slowly and said that his children could stand to be a little hungry, and the others said much the same. And that was the end of it. Cordelia had asked them to be better than fear, and they had agreed to be, and she understood in that moment that she had done more than keep them alive. She had made them for a little while into something more than a frightened crowd. She had made them a people who would starve a little for a child not their own. It was the proudest moment of her long life, and she never told a soul. The boy fought the fever for 2 more days, and on the 3rd morning near dawn, the heat broke. Cordelia, dozing at his side, woke to find his forehead cool beneath her hand, and his breath gone soft and even, and Mrs. Whitlock weeping at last, silently the tears running down her hard old face, and the boy himself looking up at them both with clear, tired eyes, and asking in a small voice if there was anything to eat. The whole chamber wept then, or nearly. People who had been strangers a week before held one another in the lantern light. And Cordelia rose, her bones aching, her own body light with hunger, and went to the shelves and made the boy his breakfast with her own hands and watched him eat it, and felt that whatever else this winter took from her, it had given her this. The fever had broken, but the food had not stopped running out, and the storm had not stopped, and the worst was still ahead of them. For the storm that had trapped them was about to do a far more terrible thing than trap them. It was going to bury them alive. The snow had been piling against the hillside for days, drift upon drift, the wind packing it harder and higher with each passing hour. And on the 4th night of the 2nd storm, sometime in the small dark hours, the slope above the shelter let go. Cordelia woke to a sound she had never heard before, and hoped never to hear again. A deep, grinding, rushing roar, felt as much as heard, that came down through the earth itself, and shook the timber beams of the ceiling, and sent dust sifting down through the lantern light. The whole hill seemed to shudder. People cried out in the dark. The boy began to wail, and then, as suddenly as it had come, the roar stopped, and there was silence. And into that silence came a new and terrible quality that Cordelia recognized at once. The air had changed. The faint, living movement of it, the draw of the stovepipe, the small breath of the door had ceased. The chamber had gone still and close and dead. She knew what had happened before she climbed the steps to confirm it. The snow had come down off the slope in a great slide and buried the upper door entirely, packed it solid under tons of snow, sealed them into the hill as completely as a stone seals a tomb. And worse, far worse, she understood as she stood at the foot of the steps and looked up at the dead air. The slide had buried the stovepipe too, or choked it. For the smoke was no longer drawing, and a fire that cannot send its smoke away will send it instead into the room. And a room full of sleeping people with a fire, and no air, is a room full of the dead by morning. "Put out the fire," she said. Her voice cut through the dark and the crying hard and clear, and something in it made them obey before they understood. "Put it out. Now. All of it. The stove, the lanterns, every flame. Do it now." They smothered the fire. They put out the lanterns, and the chamber went black and cold, utterly black, the deep total dark of the buried earth. And into that dark, Cordelia spoke again, calm and steady, because she had learned long ago that in a crisis the people around you take their fear or their courage from the one who leads. And she would give them courage if she had to dig it out of her own terror to do it. "Listen to me," she said. "We are not in danger of freezing yet. The hill will hold the cold off for hours the way it always has. The danger is the air, and the air is bad because the fire was fouling it, and the pipe is blocked. So we will have no fire until we have cleared the pipe. We will sit in the dark and the cold, and we will breathe slow, and we will dig. Do you understand me? We are not buried to die here. We are only buried until we dig ourselves out. And dig ourselves out we will." She set them to it in the dark. She knew the shelter now better than she knew her own hands, every shelf and beam and corner of it. And she did not need light to find her way. She found the stovepipe where it ran up through the ceiling, and by feel she traced it. And she understood that the blockage was up near the top, where the pipe passed out through the hillside, choked now with packed snow. And she understood, too, that if they could clear that one channel, that single narrow path, for the smoke and the air, then they could have fire again, and air again, and live. It was the design that saved them. August Reed had built the pipe to draw the smoke up and away through the hill, and in building it, he had built the one slender lifeline they now needed. They could not dig out the great buried door, not with their hands, not against tons of slide-packed snow. But the pipe was a different thing. The pipe was a narrow path already made, and a narrow path can be cleared. She had the tallest of the men stand on the grain barrels and reach up into the pipe with a length of stovewood, working it up against the packed snow, breaking it loose, drawing it down. It was slow, brutal, blind work in the freezing dark. The cold deepened around them as the hours passed. The hill's slow steadiness no longer enough now that the fire was dead, and the people huddled together for warmth, and breathed the thin, foul air in slow, shallow breaths, as Cordelia had told them. And the men worked the pipe in shifts, and the boy whimpered against his grandmother in the black. And Cordelia moved among them in the dark, touching a shoulder here, a hand there, speaking low and steady, holding them together by the sound of her voice alone. She thought of August Reed as she worked. She thought of the man who had built this place against the winter, and how the winter had taken him anyway out on an ordinary errand, far from the safety of his own design. And she thought that perhaps this was the lesson she had not been able to name before, the hard lesson in his death, that no shelter is ever perfect, that the cold is patient and finds the gaps, that a person does not survive the winter by building the right walls once and trusting them forever, but by staying awake, by staying afraid in the right way, by being ready to dig in the dark when the hill itself turns against you. She kept them alive on that thought, and on the sound of her own voice, through the longest night any of them had ever known. And near dawn, the man working the pipe gave a hoarse cry, and a fall of loose snow came rattling down the inside of the pipe and scattered across the cold stove, and a thin breath of clean air came down behind it. A breath of clean, cold air drawn down the cleared pipe from the world above. They had broken through. Cordelia waited a long, careful while, letting the chamber breathe, letting the foul air clear, and the clean air fill it before she let them light so much as a single candle. And then, when she was sure, she lit the kindling in the stove herself, and the fire caught and the smoke went up the cleared pipe, and away drawing clean and true as it had been built to draw, and the warmth came creeping back into the frozen chamber, and the people wept again, for the third time in that long week. But this time it was the weeping of the saved. They had food enough barely for a few days more. The pipe was clear, the air was good, the fire burned. They had survived the slide. But the great door was still buried, sealed under tons of snow, and they could not get out, and the supplies were nearly gone, and the storm above showed no sign of ending. They had won the night. They had not yet won the winter. And it was then into the exhausted quiet of the morning after that Garrett Hadley came. The storm broke at last on the 6th day into a hard, bright, clear cold, and the men of the shelter spent the better part of that day digging out the buried door from the inside, breaking through the packed slide snow foot by foot, until at last they broke into daylight and stood blinking in the brilliant white world. And it was as they stood there, in the clear doorway gulping the clean air, that they saw the line of figures coming up the hillside through the snow. Garrett Hadley led them. There were 4 others with him. Valley men, the kind who could be hired to stand behind a man with money and a claim, and they came up the slope toward the open door of the shelter with the heavy, purposeful tread of men who have come to do an unpleasant thing and mean to do it quickly. Garrett stopped before the door. His eyes moved past the men who had dug it out into the warm, bright chamber beyond, across the shelves and the people and the steady stove, and Cordelia watched the calculation move behind his face. The swift, greedy reckoning of a man seeing for the first time the true value of what he meant to take. And then his eyes found her standing in the doorway of the shelter alive. For a moment he could not speak. He had not expected her. He had perhaps heard that there was an old woman among the squatters in the hills. But he had not let himself imagine it was her, the woman he had cast out with bread and a blanket, the woman who should by every reckoning be dead in a drift on the road to town these 3 weeks past. And here she stood in the doorway of a shelter full of food, and people hale and hard-eyed and entirely alive, and the sight of her struck the words from his mouth. "You," he said at last. "Me," said Cordelia. He gathered himself. He was not a brave man, but he was a greedy one, and greed will sometimes do the work of courage. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up. "This land is mine," he said. "All of it. The hills, this hillside, this." He gestured at the door, the chamber, the whole of August Reed's life's work. "Whatever this is. I have the title. It's filed, it's signed, it's lawful. And every one of you is squatting on my property." His eyes swept the gathered people, hardening. "I want you off it. All of you. Today. Take what you can carry and go back to your own homes and leave my land and my..." His eyes flicked greedily again to the laden shelves. And leave what's on it. A murmur of fear and anger moved through the people behind Cordelia. They were valley folk. They knew what a filed title meant, knew the weight the law gave to a paper signed before a clerk in the town. Several of them had no homes left to go back to their cabins crushed or buried, and to be sent out now into the snow with the food behind them and the cold ahead was to be sentenced to the death they had only just escaped. The same sentence Cordelia had been given 3 weeks before. Garrett Hadley meant to do to all of them exactly what he had done to her. Cordelia looked at the paper in his hand and then at his face, and she felt the old cold clarity settle into her. The same clarity she had felt in the kitchen on the day he cast her out, when she had seen the railroad survey and understood at last what was being done to her, and why. That land was August Reed's, she said. Garrett blinked. The name meant something to him. She saw it move across his face, a flicker of something quickly hidden. Reed's dead, he said. Years dead. The land's unclaimed and I've claimed it. That's the law. The Hadleys took the bottomland from him. Cordelia went on, her voice steady, carrying meant for the people behind her, as much as for the man in front. Took the good land and pushed him up into these hills into the worthless ground and thought no more of it. And up here in the ground, you left him. August Reed built this. A shelter against the very winter that's killing this valley now. He built it, and he stored it. And when he died, it waited. And it saved my life. And it has saved every one of these people's lives this past week. She took a step toward him in the doorway. And now you mean to take it from us the way your family took the rest from him? To sell it to the railroad and put us all out in the snow? Is that the law too, Garrett? He flushed. The flicker of the railroad named openly before all these people had landed. She saw the men behind him glance at one another. Saw the word survey move among them. Garrett had not meant for the railroad to be spoken of. The railroad was the thing beneath the thing, the reason for all of it, and he had wanted it kept quiet, wanted the title clean and the people gone before any of them understood what the land was truly worth, or why he wanted it so badly. What I do with my own land is my own business, he said, but there was less iron in it now. It is not your land, Cordelia said. I have the title. You have a paper, she said. A paper you signed 3 weeks ago, over a man not yet a month in his grave because you knew the railroad was coming, and you meant to be the only Hadley with a name on the deed. I saw the survey on Silas's desk. Garrett. I saw the figures. I saw the lawyer's note about heirs. That's why you cast me out the day Silas died, isn't it? Not because I was a burden, because I was Silas's widow, and a widow has a claim. And you couldn't bear a second name beside yours on that deed, when the railroad's money was so close you could taste it. The silence that followed was absolute. The valley people behind her had gone very still, and they were looking now not at Cordelia, but at Garrett. And the looks on their faces had changed. They were beginning to understand. The thing that had been done to this old woman, the thing being done now to them, was not the lawful clearing of innocent squatters from a man's land. It was a grasping, greedy, half-hidden thing, a young man clearing the field of every claim that stood between him and a railroad's fortune, and willing to send a house full of freezing people to their deaths to do it. Garrett saw the change in their faces, and it frightened him, and frightened men grow hard. It doesn't matter what you saw, he said, his voice rising. It doesn't matter what any of you think. The title is filed. The law is the law. And the law says, this is my land, and you are trespassing on it, and I have these men here to see you off it. He gestured at the 4 valley men behind him who shifted uneasily, less certain now than they had been. So get your things and get out. All of you, now. And it was then, in that frozen moment on the threshold with the law and the cold and the hired men all standing against them, that Cordelia remembered the ledger. She remembered a line in it, a strange line, one of August Reed's scattered explanations. One she had read a dozen times and never understood because it had not seemed to fit. Among the practical notes of wood and food and temperature, she had taken it for the wandering of a lonely man's mind. But now, standing in the doorway with everything turning on the question of who this land truly belonged to, the line came back to her whole. And at last, she understood it. The land remembers its own August Reed had written, in a hand more careful than the rest. What was taken can be left again to whoever keeps the cold out. It is laid up where the warmth begins against the day the valley needs it. Where the warmth begins. She had read it as grief as the rambling of a man who had lost everything to the cold and built his whole life around keeping it out. But it was not grief. It was a direction. August Reed had laid something up against the day the valley would need it. Somewhere that the warmth began. The stove. "Wait," Cordelia said. Something in her voice stopped them all, Garrett included. She turned from the door and walked back into the chamber to the small iron stove at its center, the heart of the place where the warmth began. She knelt before it, ignoring the ache in her old bones, and she ran her hands over the stones of its base, the broad, flat hearthstones August Reed had set beneath it. And there, beneath the front stone where her fingers found a seam too straight and too clean to be the work of chance, she pried and the stone lifted. And beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was a flat tin box. The chamber had gone silent again. Even Garrett had come a few steps down into the room, drawn despite himself, watching as the old woman drew out the box and opened it there, on the warm hearthstones in the lantern light. Inside were papers. They were August Reed's papers, kept dry and whole all these years beneath the warmth of his own stove, against the day he had foretold, but not lived to see. There was the original deed to the bottomland, the good land the Hadleys had taken, with the boundaries marked in Reed's own careful hand, and a date that predated the Hadley claim by years. There was a letter sworn and witnessed before some long-ago clerk setting out how the land had been taken from him, the wrong of it laid down plain and legal. And there was one thing more, the thing that turned the whole winter on its hinge. It was a deed of gift, a document drawn up and witnessed and lawful, in which August Reed, having no family left living, set down his wish for the disposal of all that was his. The hills, the shelter, the stores, everything he had built and saved in the ground the Hadleys had left him. He left it not to any person by name, for he had no one. He left it in his own strange and careful words to whoever keeps the cold out, to whoever should come to the shelter in their need, and use it as he had built it to be used to keep the people of the valley alive through the winters they feared. He had foreseen in his lonely, grieving wisdom that one day the valley would need what he had stored, and he had made sure in the most lawful way a lonely man could manage that, when that day came, the shelter would belong to the one who used it rightly, and not to any grasping soul who came after, with a paper and a claim. Cordelia rose slowly, the deed of gift in her hands, and she turned to face Garrett Hadley. "You filed your claim 3 weeks ago," she said. "This is dated 6 years back, witnessed and sworn. It is older than your paper, Garrett, and it is lawful, and it gives this land and everything on it not to the Hadleys who stole it, but to whoever keeps the cold out." She looked around the chamber, at the people August Reed had never met, and yet had reached down the years to save. "That's us. That's these people. That's the use he built it for. Your title doesn't stand against this. No clerk in that town will let it stand, not once this is laid before him. Not once the whole valley knows how you came by your claim and what you meant to do with it." Garrett stared at the papers in her hands. He understood she could see that she was right. He was no lawyer, but he was greedy enough to know the law that touched on what he wanted. And he knew that an older deed sworn and witnessed would shatter a hasty claim filed over a fresh grave. He knew that his railroad fortune, so close he had cast out an old woman to seize it, had just slipped through his fingers. And worse than that, far worse, he understood that everyone in that chamber, and soon everyone in the valley, now knew exactly what he was. A man who would clear the dying from a shelter to sell the ground beneath them. A man who had thrown his uncle's widow into a storm to keep a deed clean. He looked around at the faces of the valley people, and there was no friend among them, not anymore. Not even among the 4 men he had brought, who were already stepping back from him, wanting no part now of what they had been hired for. "This isn't finished," Garrett said. But his voice was hollow, and everyone in the chamber heard the hollowness in it and knew that it was finished. That it had finished the moment the old woman lifted the hearthstone. "No," Cordelia agreed quietly. "It's finished." He went. There was nothing else for him to do. He turned and climbed back up out of the daylight and went down the hillside the way he had come, and the 4 hired men went after him faster than he did, eager now to be gone. And the valley people stood in the doorway of August Reed's shelter and watched Garrett Hadley dwindle down the white slope and out of their lives. He left the valley not long after Cordelia would later learn. The railroad came in time and bought its right-of-way and laid its track. But it dealt with the valley as it found it, with the people who lived there, and Garrett Hadley's name was on no deed by then, and his share of the fortune he had grasped at so hard came to nothing in the end. He had thrown an old woman into the snow to be the only name on a piece of paper, and he had ended with no land, and no name and no place in the valley at all. There was a justice in that slow and cold, like the justice of the winter itself, and Cordelia took no joy in it. But she did not grieve it either. The winter still had to be got through, and got through it was. The supplies that had run so low were stretched with hard care to the end. The storms broke at last into the long, slow thaw, and the pass opened, and the valley people went back to their cabins to dig them out and mend them and begin again. And Eli's parents came up from the town to fetch the boy weeping, and Mrs. Whitlock went with them and embraced Cordelia at the door of the shelter in a way that said more than any words could. The chamber that had held 14 souls through the worst of the winter slowly emptied until at last it held only Cordelia again, alone with the stove and the shelves and the ledger, as she had been on that first desperate night. But it was not as it had been, for now the valley knew the place and knew her, and the world above had changed. By spring, the people came up regularly to the hidden shelter. Some came to trade, bringing seed and tools and the early produce of the thaw in exchange for the last of the stores. Some came to mend the entrance to shore the slope above it against another slide to make right the things the hard winter had broken. And some came only to stand in the cool, dry chamber and look at the laden shelves and the steady stove and the earth-packed walls, and to understand with their own eyes the thing that had kept them all alive. And understanding it, they began to build. That was the truest fruit of that winter, and the one August Reed had foreseen when he laid up his papers beneath the warmth of his stove. The valley learned. The men began to dig their root cellars deeper into the hillsides, down into the steady earth, away from the open air, that the cold reached through every wall. Families spoke of underground storage in a way they never had before, raising their grain on stones against the damp, sealing their stores against the rot building, against the winter the way August Reed had built against it, because they had seen at last, with the hard, clear sight, that only a near death can give the difference between a thing built in the open air and a thing built into the ground. The ground changes slower than the air. The whole valley knew it now. They had learned at the cost of one terrible winter. the thing that a wronged and grieving man had learned decades before them, and written down in a ledger no one had read until an old woman came in out of the snow. Winter punishes exposed living. The earth protects what it covers. It was a hard lesson, and a true one, and it would keep the valley alive through many winters yet to come. Long after the people who learned it that year were gone, and Cordelia Hadley, the old woman who had been cast out before the first snow with nothing but bread and a blanket and told to disappear, did not disappear at all. She became the keeper of the strongest shelter in the valley. She had not built it. She was always careful to say, so careful, that no one should ever mistake her for more than she was. She had not built the shelter, had not stored its food, had not understood the winter well enough to fear it properly until the winter had nearly killed her. All of that had been August Reed, the wronged man, the lonely man, the man whose careful, patient labor had reached down 6 years past. His own death to save a stranger's life, and then a whole valley's. The shelter was his. The understanding was his. The mercy was his. But she had understood why it worked. That was her part, and it was not a small one. She had come into the dark of August Reed's shelter half dead and knowing nothing, and she had read his ledger and learned his lessons and grasped the why of the place, the steady earth and the dry air, and the single channel of the pipe, the order in which everything served its purpose. And because she had understood it, she had been able to use it to stretch a single man's winter to hold 14 souls to clear the pipe in the dark when the slide came down, to keep the people alive and together, and even for a little while better than their fear. She had not built the shelter, but she had become the one person living who understood it, as its builder had. And in a valley that had nearly died for want of that understanding, it made her the most valuable soul among them. She lived out her years there in the high country, the keeper of the buried place. The valley people looked after her in the way the rescued look after the one who saved them. And she wanted for nothing in her old age, she who had been thrown away with bread and a blanket. And in the long winter evenings, she would sit by the small iron stove, where the warmth began with August Reed's ledger open in her lap, adding her own careful entries beneath his, keeping up the count, recording the cold above and the steady cool below, so that whoever came after her in some winter, she would not live to see, would find the lessons waiting, and would understand and would survive, for that was the whole of it in the end. That was the thing. The winter had taught her the thing she had carried up the hillside, half dead, and come at last to understand. A shelter is not stone and timber and stored food alone. A shelter is understanding passed down, kept alive, written in a ledger by one careful hand, and another against the day it will be needed. August. Reed had understood the winter and had not lived to share it, and so his understanding had waited buried beneath the hill like the mercy it was, until the day a wronged woman came in out of the cold and read his words and grasped at last why the earth protects what it covers. And the soft click of a closing door, which had followed her down the road into the storm on the worst afternoon of her life, was not after all the end of Cordelia Hadley's story. It was only the door of the world she had lost closing, so that the door in the side of the hill might open and let her into the story she was meant for all along.